So, of course, on top of the massage therapy, which I didn't believe in at first, and then I eventually, I came to believe it. I came to justify it in my mind, and also my therapist was, she was validating me. So when I would come back and I would say, oh, well, I learned that I have some like deep muscle tissue problems because of, insert traumatic childhood event here. She would validate those claims. And so I came to justify them just because of being young and naive and not knowing how to think critically. So anyway, we would continue with the therapy sessions on top of the massage therapy sessions. Eventually, and I can't remember at what point, but I do remember it being pretty early on when I first started going to my therapist, I was diagnosed as bipolar. Not bipolar. I've never, since then I've never been diagnosed as bipolar, and I have gone to a subsequent few other therapists. In retrospect, my diagnosis as bipolar came about because I acted out the diagnosis. Like I said, when I got admitted into therapy, I was 17 years old. I was being an angsty teenager. I had an influx of hormones go through my body at a rapid rate, and I was depressed, and then I was anxious, and I was being a teenager, and my mother didn't recognize that for some idiotic reason and threw me in therapy. Now, I didn't notice the patterns of depression and then mania. I didn't notice the pattern until after I was diagnosed with bipolar. So that is also an interesting thing to note, is that once my therapist told me I was bipolar, that is when my depression and my mania started acting out, like I said, like clockwork in a pattern. 1 week for 7 days, for 7 set days, I would be depressed. And then the next week for 7 set days, I would be in a mania. That did not occur until after I was diagnosed bipolar. I want to make that very, very clear. I myself was acting out the diagnosis that I was given. I want to make that crystal clear. So, I was diagnosed bipolar. Well, you would think that since bipolar is a relatively serious mood disorder, that I would have been referred to a psychiatrist, or at the very least a general practitioner, so that I could be put on medication. If you know anyone who is actually bipolar, or, if you read any of the literature, you know how serious of a mood disorder it is. There's a fairly high risk for suicide in the depressive episodes. In the manic episodes, people do things like spend their entire life savings because their self-esteem's big, and they'll just gamble it away because they'll win. And it's a horrible, vicious cycle. Bipolar is an actual mood disorder. I was never put on medication for bipolar disorder. That should have been a very big clue to maybe not me as young as I was, but probably to my mother or anybody else who I told about my diagnosis. And no one said anything. So that tells me about the level of critical thinking that is out in the world, at least within my family. Somehow the problems then seem to solidify upon my father. All of my problems seem to go back to my father. Nothing, ironically, went back to my mother because my mother and I had a good relationship at the time. But my father and I did not, for various reasons, and they're not even that important. Like I said, I was an angsty teenager, and he was my parent, and I therefore took out my emotions on him. That's kind of what teenagers do. So a lot of my problems, when I started focusing on them, would go back to my father. this wasn't necessarily something that I had brought up myself. I think that when I was talking to her, I had brought up the fact that my father and I didn't get along very well, and then she kind of ran with that. The reason that my father and I didn't get along very well, aside from me just being an angsty teenager and unfortunately taking it out on him, was because I didn't live with him either. So it's very easy to blame somebody who's not there all the time. And she took that piece of information and she literally, from then on, would relate every problem that I had back to my father. Oh, well, your father didn't hug you enough. You didn't have enough of a fatherly influence on your life. That's why you're like that. That's why you feel the things that you feel. That's why you can't have a healthy relationship with a man right now. All these kind of things. And it was ridiculous. I literally, everything that I told her would go back to my father. And eventually, I remember saying something to her like, I really don't want to deal with this right now. That was kind of my nice way of saying, like, shut the fuck up about my dad. And she said to me, okay, that's fine. But I do want to get back to this eventually. I think it's a very important thing. And I remember I would I had to tell her in a few sessions, like, I don't want to talk about my dad this session. I don't want to talk about my dad. And she would always say the same thing. But it wasn't, the problem was not my father. I just wanted somebody to tell my problems to and to help me solve them. That's all that I wanted. And she, for some reason, wanted to pinpoint somebody in my life to be like, well, this is the stem of all your problems. I don't know why she did that. Maybe it was easier for her. Anyway, my father did come in with me for a session of therapy. I don't exactly remember what was said, but it's not important because apparently my therapist didn't think it was important either. After so long of harping on the fact that she thought my father was the root of all my problems, she didn't have much to say about him being there. I was surprised by that, actually. I was also, this probably happened when I was 18 or 19. I was dating a guy at the time, very unhealthy relationship, and I never really complained about him within our therapy sessions until things started to get pretty bad. When I say unhealthy relationship, probably I was never like beaten or physically abused. Not violently anyway. But he was very good at emotionally abusing me and constantly just degrading me. Everything I had to say was, well, you're just stupid. You're just young and stupid. You don't know anything. And lots of verbal abuse coming along with the emotional abuse. And eventually it culminated in he started raping me. And I brought all of this up to my therapist. I didn't call it rape at the time, but I did say something to her like, well, we had sex the other day and it was uncomfortable for me. I didn't feel like I wanted to have sex, but then I just convinced myself that was, that was wrong of me to have felt that. And then I would bring up his emotional abuse, his emotional abuse, the things that he would say to me and how they made me feel. It made me feel like dirt, less than dirt. I would be telling him my dreams for the future and he would just be like, well, that's not happening because you're too stupid and you don't know what you're doing at all in life. That kind of stuff. And she responded by telling me that I just needed to try harder. That it wasn't that he was bad for me. It's not that he was toxic or unhealthy for me to be around. It's just that, I needed to try harder. I needed to understand him. He even came in with me to a session, and after I broke up with him, I would bring him up in subsequent sessions with her and be like, like he treated me. And she would say, he's not, he's not your problem. Your problem is your father, and, he seemed like a nice guy. He just seemed like a nice guy. Well, yeah, he fucking would. He's not gonna start yelling at me in the middle of a therapy session. Fucking duh. Maybe I didn't tell her in a way that made her realize the immediacy of how unhealthy my relationship with this man was.